Hi, Irina. How you doing?
Hi, how are you? Fine.
Yeah,
Just
awesome.
happy that I got rid of one meeting.
Ah, okay. So you came from the meeting directly into this one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so great that you're our guest today, and I guess you want to talk about building RESTful APIs, right? And tell us about how to do it right.
Yep. Not to do it perfectly, but at least one step further than you are currently doing your REST APIs. I
Okay.
made this as a, I don't know, personal vendetta, I guess, against REST-ish APIs.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
I
Yeah.
understand. Okay, so I'm curious. So I would say, take the floor. It's yours.
Thank you. So, first of all, we cannot talk about how to properly implement a REST API without talking a bit about REST, right? So
Mhm.
now when we start to do an API, we all say that we're doing REST APIs, when in fact, some of us are kind of actually implementing JSON over HTTP because we're not using and we are not looking at the underlying protocol very
Mhm.
much. So we're transporting data and kind of that's it. So I don't want to tell all the constraints of REST or what REST should mean, but at least I want to emphasize that each request response in REST should be self-descripted. So being self-descripted basically means that each individual request and response has everything it needs in there, either in headers, either in the body, but is there. And by looking at a request or a response, you might be able to understand what's needed in there in isolation without knowing what requests were before or what will follow next. So, how do you add meaning? You add meaning, first of all, by using the proper verbs. I've been there and I also did it. I used to update some entities, I used post as a verb. And that's a big no no. But when I first started with programming 11 years ago, that was the way of implementing things in ASP, MVC at least. And that was the pattern, and I followed along. But that is bad. Okay, you should use post whenever you are creating a new resource. Another way of adding meaning to your messages, it's through using media types. And of course, we all know media types. We know application, HTML, JSON, and so on. I'm talking about those media types and MIME types that we are using and all know about. But how about creating your own custom media types? It would be cool because it will also add meaning. And also, another way is through requests, headers, or response headers. Using the header, that pair that you can give a name and a value, is a way of transporting data back and forth that will help your server understand what you want in there. For example, you can add the culture that is needed through a header or an authentication detail by including a JVT token in there. It's a way of hydrating your request. And last but not least, if we're talking about the responses, we have status codes. And we have status codes in an amount of 63 of them. Of course, I'm not saying you to use all of them, but at least use more than, I don't know, 404 and 500 if it happens, and bad requests. Because status codes are supposed to add meaning and to tell the client what's wrong if something is wrong. But in fact, if we're talking about REST, REST means leveraging the HTTP power, pretty much. And you need to look at this protocol, HTTP, and to understand what's happening behind the scenes and what it offers, because it offers a lot. So let's look at some code. In .NET, there are a lot of things that you can tweak when it comes to REST APIs that aren't there enabled by default. For example, in here I have a conference API with two controllers, one that is about talks and one that is about speakers. It has create, read, update, delete implemented, and some other things that I will show you. But for example, if we look at the speakers, we can see here that we have get speaker by ID, which is an endpoint that we should have, or get speakers that will return a collection of speaker, the entire collection. Okay, but if I were to ask how many of you are implementing HTTP head or leveraging this verb, HTTP head,
Yeah.
I kind of didn't do that
Nope.
until I had a proper scenario. So there are a lot of things that you can simply add in here and you can tweak and it works just fine. For example, I have a Postman collection that will simply make a request to the endpoint and get what I want. For example, I have localhost because I'm running on localhost. I have speakers and I have the speaker by ID because this is a convention that we kind of all use. And also, if I can give an advice, when you're working with resources in REST, please try to keep it under the convention in terms of you have a resource that is called speakers and that represent the collection, add that in there. If you want to look at a speaker by ID, add the ID in there and respect this convention. Because by adding the proper verbs, you can obtain different things from the server. For example, if you have this speaker/1, you can change the verb to create a put and you will update the entity that you're referring to here. Or maybe you can delete the same speaker. You have the same endpoint, the same URI, but by using the proper verb, you'll get different, you'll have different options of obtaining things.
So Irina, do you tend to use just the basic verbs, the standard HTTP verbs, or do you also introduce custom verbs in your APIs?
No, I'm using the standard verbs just because they are covering pretty much everything.
Yeah.
Postman is a great tool. It offers you also a lot of verbs, but you also need to have the proper scenario to use them.
Yeah. Right.
If you use the get, post, put, patch, maybe, and delete, and head, and options, because we kind of all have Angular apps for the client side or React, you cover everything. So the other ones you can kind of ignore for now. But with get and .NET API, if you issue a request, you'll see that everything that comes back is JSON, because that's the way it's created, is JSON. It will return JSON no matter what you specify in the headers. For example, in the accept header, you can specify the format you as a client expect from the server. So if I write here that I want an application XML, this won't be taken into consideration. It will return JSON no matter what, okay?
Right.
So maybe you also want to write XML, right? So if you want to write XML, you need to go ahead and tweak this. Make .NET understand that you want to respond with the proper format that it asked. So you can have in here add controllers. In Web API, you will have add controls as a default option, but you can also tweak this. And of course, you will have, by sending a Lambda in here, you will have options respect browser accept header. And if you enable this, because by default it's set to false, now when you issue a request, Web API, the server, will look at the header and actually take that into account. So by adding this respect browser accept header, it's kind of not enough. In our case, we want to respond with XML, and Web API doesn't know how to write XML without adding this contract serializer. It's the default one. If you have something specific that you have in your business, you can go ahead and create your own serializer to write in the format you want. For example, I don't know, if you have a list of contacts, maybe you want to return vCard format, and then you need to write an output formatter for that.
And if you specify an accept header as the client that is not supported, is the default then still JSON?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's
Forever
always
and
the
ever.
default.
Yeah, that's all you'll get.
But I guess you can also influence that using that other option you've got there, Irina, the return HTTP not acceptable.
Yeah. if you do not enable that also, when you request something from the server that server doesn't know how to process, it won't respond with 406 as a status code. So in add controllers, there in options, you have a lot of buttons that you can press in order to make your life easier. And
or more difficult.
Or more difficult, why not? But now, if we go back to the Postman collection and a reissue, now we're seeing a different format. Now it actually listens to what we add in the accept header as MIME type. So the format, it's not JSON anymore. You look, it's ugly as an XML, but it's a different format, because REST in itself, it's about a different representation of the same resource. It's not different resources, it's the same, but written in a different manner. So, okay. So now if I try to say, hey, server, I want back an application XML1, you'll see that it will get you 406 not acceptable. So this 406 is basically the server telling you, hey, I get you. I'm looking at your accept header, but I do not know how to write that application XML1. You'll either, you need to implement that yourself if you want to consume it. So of course, the behavior doesn't change if you add the default one, the JSON. It's 200 okay and still there. Okay, let's see what we can. The head. We didn't talk about the head. So speakers is the list, is the endpoint that returns a list of something, speakers in our case. And if I issue a head request, you'll see that method not allowed. Why? Because this is how I implemented in the code. But if I'm not mistaken, speakers as a collection, let's think of this. The head as a verb, it's supposed to return a status code, but not the body as the response. So if you look at a collection, what would be the scenario where you call the collection endpoint and you say, hey, is the collection there, or is there something there? It kind of doesn't make sense, but it might make sense if you have a proper scenario. But if you look at speakers by ID, maybe you want to have a scenario where you poll for something, or you send something to a enqueue and to process, and you say, hey, is this processed? You don't care about the status. You care to see if it's there or something like that. And you send the request, and now you get a 200 okay, but no body as a response. But what you'll need to do in Web API is to implement that yourself. So we're using these attributes. You have the get, which is the most common and known. But for the HTTP head, we kind of, well, don't do this. For example, we want to see if a speaker exists. And how do we do that? Is just by calling the repository and passing on the ID. If the speaker exists, well, we send back a 200 okay. And if the speaker is not there, we should say, hey, no content. So maybe the speaker is not there. It's not necessarily not found. It's up to you, but it should have a meaning.
Right. So the fact that a head request should never return a body, that is something that you have to take care of yourself, right? So if you, for example, were to return something from this check if speaker exists method, then ASP.NET Core wouldn't mind, right? It would just put it in the response, and you would break that HTTP convention.
That's a very good question. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to send something as an OK parameter to see what's happening. But HTTP head as an RFC description is meant not to send the body.
Right.
But it's actually very interesting to see. So speakers one, we know that is there. If we send this, it's a 200 OK, but still no body. So it doesn't matter what you add in there.
Okay.
It won't send that.
Yeah.
Nice.
Very nice. Okay. So I won't talk about HTTP put because it's pretty much the same behavior, but you just add the verb in there and the logic, it's up to you. Okay, let's see. Options. Options. We can't ignore this verb. It has a very important role in terms of security. This will tell on a specific endpoint what the client is supposed to do or allowed to do. And the HTTP options, it's basically implementing like this. You add in the response headers, the allow header, and you specify the verbs that the client is supposed to do. So if we're thinking about the client apps are using an HTTP options by default. We don't care about that. They issue an HTTP option request and then the actual requests. There are a lot to talk about this, the HTTP options as a verb and its role. But let's see if we find this here. But if we don't, we're just gonna change the speakers and send. 200 okay. Nobody, because we don't return a body. But in the header, we have what we added. So in this specific endpoint, speakers, you are allowed to do a get, an options, and a post, supposedly. But it's up to you to enforce that only these verbs are implemented in there. Okay. Some other things that I want to talk about REST and in terms of REST is about what you can tweak in startup besides this return HTTP not acceptable, browser accept header, and so on. Well, we have something that we can tweak, and I'm just going to uncomment this because I don't know if the demo gods will have me today. So it's safer this way, and I'm just going to explain. So after you add the data contract serializer, you can also configure your API behavior with a few things that are very important and save you a lot of the hassle that you also do in your code. For example, you can configure what happens if the model is in invalid state. For example, you're trying to update something or you're trying to create something and the field is not corresponding to your business rules. So in order to do that, you can return a validation problem details, passing on the context and the model state. And what will happen is that will generate a type of response, the same format every time, because this I've seen in a lot of teams that I worked with. They have problems when it comes to, okay, what is the format of the error that we're sending?
Right.
So and this is particularly important when you want to interpret it, right, as a system, because we as humans, we can read stuff that comes back and then we can figure out what went wrong. But if it's structured, then I can actually do something with the response. So that's really important.
Exactly. And you, as a backend developer, you also need to think about your colleague that is implementing the UI, the front-end app, and you should return the same format every time. And that format should be standardized across teams to better, I don't know, interpret them or extract them and whatever. But you can have something like this. And also there is a format, a content type that you can send back with the response called application problem JSON that has a specific format. It's standardized. It's one of the, I think, 3 or 4 format for error descriptions, describing. You can have here the title. If you have, you can extract that from the context, or also you can add the generic one. You can give the details, the instance, so where the actual error happened. And if you have some documentation regarding what it should be added in there, you can just link that as a type. And another thing that you can add in here, it's the status code. For example, there are some devs that are treating their model validation errors as bad requests. But bad requests should be looked at as format correctness. I mean, if you have all the fields, everything that is needed in that request, you're fine. The content of those fields is a different thing.
Yeah.
So that's why I advise people to use 422 status code, which means unprocessable entity, because it's not a bad request if you add an extra, I don't know, character in one of the fields. It's simply, the request is well formed, but the content of it is different.
Right. Because if the request wouldn't be well formed, it wouldn't also be able to do the automatic model validation, because it cannot even deserialize the message, right? But it was able to do that, but then the content is wrong. So that's a very good distinction to make.
So I also have here a post that breaks the validation that I added. The title field shouldn't be more than 100 characters. Well, I add more than 100 characters. I had the description, and if I issue the request, I will get back unprocessable entity and the type and the title, the status code, the instance, and also an error object that is basically an array of stuff. So think about it. If you have this very specific format every time an error happens that is related to validation, for a UI developer, it's very easy to extract from errors, the fields and so on, and to add this displayed with red or something like that.
Did you add this error by hand, or was this error created by putting those, you can use these attributes on your data types, right?
Yeah, it's simply like that. Just add it in the entities. Let's see, this is a talk, the data notation that we're used to. Simple as that. So just by passing the context and the model state, it will know to extract things from there. If you really want to treat this as bad request, but it's not that nice, you can simply change in here the status code, and instead of unprocessable entity object result, just add bad request object result, and that will work just fine. And a thing that I really enjoyed about this is because it removes a bit of the code that we need to write. For example, I'm going to look into the controller that is stocks controller. Let's see which of these. Here. So if you add the model validation and the API behavior, you can remove all of these. So whenever you are checking that if model set is valid, you blah, blah, blah.
Boilerplate code.
Yeah. You can, here is a bad request, but you can remove these altogether. It will simply work. Nice. It will return this format every time. Without you. Okay, if actually I'm using this with my students. I'm trying to teach them the flow of the code. Hey, first you need to check if that thing that is passed on to you is valid, and then you save it in the database and so on. But well, it's up to you to tweak this. But also, since we're here and I've seen this, as the best practice, when you're creating a new entity, you should return something like this, created at the route, because that will return a location header in your response. Here it won't work, but here, let's see if I have a correct body. Nope. Let's see. I'm going to do like this. I'm going to change this. And the response that I get is the 201, not the 200 OK. It's still from the same category. It starts with 2. It's success status codes, but specifically it means that your entity was created. And more than that, if you look at the headers, you'll see what's the ID and basically the location of the new created entity. So, okay, I created this. You can find that at this URL. So you can extract this and create further. So this is something that I kind of do mandatory. I'm try to teach everyone to, do this, because it's a different thing that a 200 OK. Okay, it was processed just because it started with 2, but it was created, and here's the location for it.
I actually had a team which I also taught this, because what they did every time they created something, they said, yeah, I want to show that on the screen. So what I do, I will return it from the post. And I think that's wrong, right? You do a post and you want to know whether or not it worked, and you don't want to have the created entity. That's weird. So I think this is a very cool way, because then you can use this location to actually get to the entity that you just created as a resource. So that's, I think
Exactly.
it's a
Yeah.
way better to do it like this.
Because you can also return the body, because what the body will have is the ID that is assigned,
Sure. Yeah.
but pretty much
But not repeat the entire entity. That's a bit weird.
exactly. Yeah. And the thing with the location in the header, it's much nicer and cleaner. You
Yeah.
maybe you shouldn't transfer everything back because you just sent it to the server.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this is with the uh, status codes, and I think we need to talk a bit about versioning.
Mhm.
Just because versioning is a very overlooked subject. I mean, I've seen, I'm gonna look through my slides to see if we look at the versioning stuff. The versioning part, it's related to this syntagm, cool URIs don't change. So if you have speakers and you have the ID after the speakers, and you have after the ID something that is related to that speaker, like an hierarchical entities, well, if you change those, when you change the version, isn't you change the URIs, and
Yeah.
you might end up with something not found in your website or the client app. So besides the fact that the things should be concrete, nothing's just the specific resource dogs, for example, and the variation of these shouldn't be a new endpoint altogether. It should be like, okay, you have to obtain all the black dogs. Cool for you. Add it in the query string as parameter, not a new endpoint like get all black dogs.
No.
It shouldn't work like that. So I'm gonna scroll down because I have a lot of verbs that I was talking, and looking at the versioning, the V1. I think you've seen this in a lot of examples. It's V1. When the devs start implementing a new API, they do new route V1 and then API and so on. But
Is that still the default now in the ASP.NET Core template?
no, it's not the default. The default is like API and the controller.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not the V1, but people just go there and add the V1, and the application is dying. The companies are closing and changing names and so on, but the V1 is still there.
It's either a V1 or it's a date, right? That's also really cool to do. So 2021, and then yeah. Seen them a lot.
So adding a V1 or the version in the path of the URL is not cool to do, because Roy Fielding, the inventor of REST, told in 2013 Twitter that, well, the reason to make a real REST API is to get evolvability. That's all about REST, evolvability. Yeah. But when you add the V1 in the URL path, you're just showing a middle finger to your API customers, just because you will force them to change when you need to release a new version of your API.
Yeah.
And for that, we have URL, but not the path, anything but the path of the URL. Yeah. So we have headers and query string for that. And cool thing in .NET is that we have a great community. And also Microsoft is great because it helps driving these communities. And we have an awesome package. And that package is called Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC versioning. And which will do for you is allow you to add a middleware, basically like this, in startup. You'll have services, add API versioning, and then you'll say, hey, I want to read my version from the header, and from the header, you need to look after this key. So when you look after that key, you can tweak this a lot, but this is the easiest thing that you can do. If we look at the versioning, so let's see, talks, no version specified. Okay. So if there is no version specified and you are not enforcing that, you still get an answer, but you can specify a version there. So you have the API version. Let's see in the header, the proper example. API version is the key that I added in there, and version 1. And I hit send, and I see that I get back ID, title, and description. And if I try to see if with version 2 it works, I have 2 versions. Send. Now I don't have the ID anymore.
Oh, yeah.
I have title and description. And this way I can have 2 versions side by side, and it's very easy to implement and to maintain in the code.
Yeah.
Because what you do is to, for example, you can have files like this, talks, that gives you the talks of a specific speaker. You add the API version attribute on top of your controller, and you add the version number in there, and pretty much you're done. But also you can have a V2. You can create another controller that you say, hey, this V2 controller will answer to everything that's related to V2. And you'll have API version and the version in there. And it's
cool.
Pretty much up to you to do this.
Yeah.
So in that attribute, I saw you can specify a is deprecated flag.
Yeah.
Does that get returned to the caller in some way?
Yeah, it should as a header. Let me get back to the Postman. So I go version 1, send, and in header, I think we also need to enable something in startup to make this work.
Okay.
But yes.
But then you can see from the response headers that specific version is deprecated. Cool.
So it kind of you give a notice to your customer, hey, if it wants to look at your headers, hey, here's your response for version 1, but it's kind of deprecated. You should move on to the newest version. And versioning actually in .NET is very easy to implement. You can create DTOs because it's never a good idea to return the entities itself. You can use, for example, AutoMapper. That's a great library. And for V1, you can have talk V1. Nothing stops you to do this. And for V2, maybe you can return V2. Why not? It's still valid.
Right. Yeah.
And the amount of work is minimal.
Yeah.
And you're not breaking your clients. And another thing, you can specify the version in query string. So query string API version is the only change that you have in here. And in here, actually, it's no need to specify API version because that's the default one that I used. But if you want, you can also add your own. If you want a V instead of whatever, you can specify it in here, and it will require only a V. And I'm going to run this.
You now still have 2 of those enabled, right? So you have the header, and so that's possible. You can do multiple.
Oh yeah.
Oh, cool.
So do you have a personal preference on which one to use, or both?
I prefer to use the header one because it's not kind of exposed. If you add it in the query, it's something that is visible, and maybe you do not want everyone to see what's the version that you're currently at. So I prefer to add it in the header. But as I mentioned, anything but the URL path works.
That's the rule.
So with V, you just add the V here. So V equals 1 and you send it. And if it works, we should get the 3 back. And also if we increase it, hopefully it's the same. We get only the 2. 2 versions side by side. I just showed this. Let's see with the deprecated stuff. But with the deprecated stuff, we need to go back a bit and to configure something else.
And maybe a question that I shouldn't ask because you were already praying to the demo gods, but what happens if I specify V1 on my query string and V2 in my header? Does it take precedence in the order that you specified them here, or does something break?
That's a very good question. Let's test this.
Yeah, I was a tester once. Sorry for that.
It didn't
Maybe
cross.
even a bad request should be returned.
Maybe,
in
yeah,
that
but
case.
Let's see. So we here version, right? Version. Let's see. API version. API version.
But you're in the query string tab.
Yeah, this parameters.
Oh, headers. API version 2.1.0.
Yes.
In fact, that there and this. Okay, let's see.
Fingers crossed.
Let's break the internet. Okay, so this is version 2.
Yeah,
version 2.
apparently.
And I think that is because you did it in the order in the startup. You specified that as the second one. But this is just I'm guessing here, but I think that's the one.
Yep, because I think if we were to think at the middlewares, it matters the order that you add.
Yeah.
The middlewares.
Yeah.
So that's why we.
But maybe for this solution, I would just add some idiot middleware. So you just get ASCII art. If you send me 2 different versions, you get a big idiot in Roman style ASCII art. So that's should be the solution for this one.
You can return the I'm a teapot HTTP status code.
Exactly.
Oh, they got something built in for that. Cool.
Yeah. And the most complete version of configuring your API versioning is just by sending options in here. So you have default API version, and you say, hey, I have the default, treat this as the default if I do not add something else. Also, I want to report the API versions that I support. Check that. And also there is the property that says, hey, assume the default version if nothing gets added in here. So it's a way of you enforcing the user. Okay, you do not send this, you'll get the latest version or something like that. Here is the same things as above. You specify where you want that. And also if something is happening and is bad, you can create your own version error provider if you want to have a specific format or so on. So now when we run this, we should see a few other things. For example, the deprecated stuff I think should work. Let's see. Headers, indeed.
Oh yeah, API deprecated versions. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the deprecated versions 1.0. And if we change this shouldn't, it returns the API supported version.
Cool.
So these headers are related to, where is it? To this.
Yeah.
Cool.
Nice.
Okay, so let's change this back. Version neutral, let's see. You can also have like endpoints that don't need versioning, like ping pong or some health check stuff that you can call from somewhere. Yeah. You can add the API version neutral attribute, and that's all fixed.
Nice.
And also you can create your custom attribute, not with V2. Let's see. Not found, because that's not the purpose of me showing you this. Doc V2. I have here something that is commented. So you have the API version, but if you prefer, you kind of can do your own version. Ning attribute. In fact, I'm going to stop this and I'm going to go there. It's V2 or whatever the naming you might find suitable. But if we go here, it's simply a CL class that inherits API version attribute. Oh. So, and sends this here. It's just, I don't know.
Okay, so this would allow you to add some more additional metadata to that attribute.
Yeah. If you want and need that. Or also maybe some people prefer this as in, I don't know.
Right.
And it will also work like this.
Yeah, this is the cool thing in ASP.NET Core, right? There's a lot of defaults that would work for, a lot of people. But if you want to customize it, it's easily customizable. So that's
cool. Yeah. You just need to know what buttons to push.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think kind of this is it, what I wanted to show you. Not before I show you one thing. That's about how you can name your resources and how you can link them. For example, starting from the speaker's controller, a speaker controller will return speaker 1 or a list. But maybe I have something that is related to a specific speaker. For example, I want to talk. And maybe I want to enforce the fact that I cannot access a talk without accessing the speaker. I don't know. Maybe there is a business rule for that. And in order for me to be able to do that, I can create the controller, do my logic in there and so on. But I can go here in the route and say, hey, you can access this controller by using the route API speakers that we already had, the previous controller, passing the speaker ID, and then talks. So there is no absolutely other way of accessing this controller than by using this format. So what you do, you can, let's say, get talks for a speaker. See, speaker 1/talks. You want all the talks for a specific speaker. So what you do is adding here 2 parameters, speaker ID and the talk ID, maybe. And you add in here the parameter for the specific action. So this will get linked from the URL, and this also get linked from the URL. And the same happens for all the talks for speaker. You pass here the speaker ID, but you do not specify it as a parameter in the action route. So you'll be able to obtain something like speaker talks, something like this, or something like this, a specific talk. And this way, when you're looking at the endpoint, you'll see, hey, this specific talk is related to this specific speaker.
Cool.
So it's hierarchical.
Nice.
And it's very easy to do this. You keep it separate in the code and everything is nice and clean. But for the outside world, it's...
And this is basically also the resource type way of doing this, right? So you have speakers, and speakers have talks, and talks on their own don't have much value here because you want to know which speaker is giving those talks. So this is how you can, structure your API.
Exactly. Or I don't know, for example, if you have a pet shop and you have pets, maybe you want to see the owners of the pet, and you cannot access owners without the proper pet. So
exactly,
might be a business case.
Yeah, that's all, it all depends on the domain, right? What's important for your domain then.
Exactly. Yeah. And also it's very important how you name your endpoints, because you shouldn't have verbs like in the get old stuff or create new in the endpoint. It should be very neat and clean like this.
And just leverage the HTTP verbs that are already there. Yeah. Cool.
So so really thinking about your design of your API, making sure that it's logical, making sure that it's self-descriptive, and maybe most important, consistent, can make it so much easier for your users to use that API. So this was a really nice talk, Irina. So thank you so much. It was really nice to see how we can apply some of those best practices in .NET. For everyone watching, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.